It's the 19th of September 1957. We are in Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. Leopold returns home after another hard day at work. He is about to climb the stairs of his apartment building when he feels a sharp sting in his neck. As he looks around, trying to understand what's going on, his eyelids suddenly feel oh so heavy. Mr. Leopold understands that something is going on and he tries to call for help, but his facial muscles are unresponsive, his speech is slurred. Finally, darkness descends and Mr. Leopold stumbles to the ground as the last breath he'll ever breathe leaves his body. Silently, his assassin steps out of the shadows, exits the building and disappears into the city. A later inquiry will find out that on that September evening, Mr. Leopold had been killed with a dart laced with curare, a poison which blocks normal neuromuscular function. Only decades later will it emerge that Mr. Leopold had been targeted by a murderous conspiracy concealed behind a sinister symbol, a blood-red hand. And he was only one of dozens of assassination victims marked for death by one of Europe's most lethal secret services, hell-bent on winning a hopeless colonial war. So step with us into the shadows as we uncover one of the most shocking chains of events that you've never heard of. The enigmatic Swiss gentleman, Mr. Leopold, and his even more mysterious assassin were but two cogs within a catastrophic plan which unfolded across France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. From 1956 to at least 1962, dozens of individuals were killed or seriously injured by a relentless sequence of stabbings, poisonings, shootings, bombings, and shipwrecks. For example, a Moroccan pharmacist and his entire family were blown apart by a Parcel bomb in April 1957, while in January of 1960, a resident of Frankfurt lost both of his hands to yet another explosion from a device concealed within a book titled The Pacification. At the time, some of those events were ascribed to unknown perpetrators, or even attributed to freak accidents. But all the victims had something in common. They were all members, sympathizers, or suppliers to the Algerian independence movement, in particular to its political organization, the National Liberation Front, or FLN, and especially to its armed wing, the National Liberation Army, or ALN. Often, far too often, victims were just innocent bystanders. The overall death toll is difficult to estimate, but it may have amounted to up to 140 victims per year. But who could be responsible for such violence? Well, in 1960, a French citizen called Christian Durier revealed to the press that he was a member of the terrorist organization responsible for those attacks. This was the Main Rouge, or the Red Hand. In the same year, one Pierre Geneve published a book which also attributed the wave of killings to the same organization. But what was the Red Hand? The name was well known to French authorities, as Red Hand terrorists had already been active in the early 1950s. This was a very aggressive, ultra-nationalist terrorist group composed of French citizens in Morocco and Tunisia. As those two former French colonies edged towards independence, the Red Hand had struck hard against the leaders of the self-determination movements. Every killing, every attack was signed with a sinister sigil, a hand of Fatima, a popular amulet in Maghreb countries painted in blood red on the door of the victim. Following the independence of Morocco and Tunisia in March 1956, the Red Hand had disappeared. So it was thought. But it seems like it had returned with a vengeance, this time to unleash their violence against the leaders and supporters of the Algerian independence movement. Or so the French public thought until the mid-1980s, when the works of authors Roger Falagot and Pascal Crop unveiled a deeper layer hidden behind the Red Hand. Apparently, Mr. Duro, the Red Hand insider, was actually an agent working for the DST, the French Internal Security Service. And that writer, Pierre Geneve, well, that was actually an alias for one Kurt-Emil Schweizer, better known as an author of erotic fiction. You might be wondering right now, what exactly is going on? Well, according to Falagot and Crop, both individuals have been instructed to talk about or write about the Red Hand by a third French national, a former resistance fighter and Dachau survivor called Marcel Mercier. Colonel Marcel Mercier. He was an officer with SDECE, France's Foreign Intelligence and Counter-Espionage Service. And Colonel Mercier worked closely with another colonel, Robert Rousselard, head of Service 8, a special division in charge of covert operations. In other words, at least 2 high-ranking officers of the French secret services were heavily implicated in hundreds of targeted assassinations and downright state-sponsored terrorism. The Red Hand was just a facade, a smokescreen to throw public opinion off the scent. And the conspiracy actually went even deeper than that. But before we look into it in detail, let's provide some important context about France's bitter colonial war in Algeria. So, following the end of World War II, France's colonial empire started to collapse. By March 1956, Morocco and Tunisia had gained independence, but Paris would not let go of Algeria as it was considered part of France's metropolitan territory. A large French-speaking community in Algeria, known as the Pieds Noirs or Black Feet, staunchly resisted any claim to independence. Algerians begged to disagree, of course, and in March of 1954, a group of young militants founded the National Liberation Front, the FLN, under the leadership of Ahmed Ben Bella. A liberation army, the ALN, soon followed, and in November 1954, its guerrilla fighters launched attacks against French military, police, and communication targets. This marked the start of the war in Algeria, which saw atrocities committed on both sides. The FLN and ALN, heavily funded by Egypt and Syria, conducted bombing and terror campaigns against both military and civilian targets, peaking at 800 attacks per month in 1957. While the French military responded with heavy-handed tactics, including violent reprisals, as well as the torture of suspected members and supporters of the independence movement. By the second half of the 1950s, the French military had scored several important tactical victories in Algeria, but were progressively losing on the public opinion front. The FLN enjoyed increasing support in North Africa, but also among European nationals who were willing to contribute with funding, weapons, and even medical treatments. And that's why the Red Hand Plan was concocted. To intimidate, harass, and eliminate top FLN leadership and their support network with a series of covert operations. As mentioned, the Service 8 of the SDECE were directly responsible, but the orders came from high above in the cabinet and staff of France's president, General Charles de Gaulle. Now, to be precise, the targets of the Red Hand mission were selected on a weekly basis by Jacques Foccart, advisor to the President for African Affairs. Also involved was Constantin Melnik, chief liaison between the cabinet and the secret services, and final approval came from Admiral Georges Cabaneret, chief of defense staff. Now, according to journalist Jacques Folleraud, writing for Le Monde, the entire operation may have been sanctioned at an even higher level. Quoting from a September 2020 article, Jacques Foccart, a trusted confidant of General de Gaulle, was in charge of secret services and African affairs. He coordinated, under the orders of the general, a program of clandestine operations against the backdrop of the Algerian conflict. Alright, so from now on, we're going to refer to this conspiracy as the Red Hand operations carried out by Service 8 agents. The true extent of their actions will likely never emerge, but we have a pretty good overview thanks to a declassified memo published in October 2020 by the Wilson Center's Digital Archive. The report appears to have been authored by some Service 8 official and is an account of actions conducted against the FLN and its supporters. It comes complete with a description of methods employed, as well as a scoring system evaluating the success of each hit. According to the memo, in January 1956, 3 explosions were triggered in Tétouan, the capital of the Spanish Protectorate in Morocco. These did not happen at random, but were made to coincide with an official meeting between André-Louis Dubois, French Resident General in Morocco, and General Garcia Villino, Spanish High Commissioner for the Protectorate. No further details were provided in the file, but we found that the meeting between the 2 colonial leaders took place on January the 10th, and an article published by Le Monde on January the 11th, 1956 states that terrorism manifested itself in Tétouan, where 6 people were wounded by the explosion of a bomb in a coffee shop. The article goes on to describe how, quote, terrorist activities and further agitation in Spanish-held Morocco may have made General Garcia Villino more receptive than in the past to considerations put forward by the Resident General Dubois concerning security in the Rif region. Now, this is only speculation on our part, but if the coffee shop bombing was indeed perpetrated by the Red Hand operatives, it may have been part of a false flag attack to spur the Spanish military into ramping up security against independence movements. The next action was directed against Moustapha Ben Boulay, a World War II veteran and leader of the anti-French insurrection since June 1954. In March 1956, a booby-trapped radio exploded in Ben Boulay's residence, claiming his life. Next in line was the political leader of the FLN, Ahmed Ben Bella. In July 1956, a Red Hand operative was ready to assassinate Ben Bella in the streets of Cairo by using a suppressed firearm. But the operation was cancelled at the last moment following government orders. The French government would deal with Ben Bella on October 22, 1956, when the Air Force intercepted a plane carrying the leader and 4 members of his leadership, including future Algerian President Mohamed Boudiaf. Authorities searched the latter, finding an interesting document. It was the transcript of an interrogation carried out by Spanish security services on one Ludwig Trapp, a German national who had deserted from the French Foreign Legion. This finding would reveal an unexpected alliance linking the FLN to the Foreign Legion deserters, German secret services, and German arms dealers. Now, we're going to expand on this German connection in a later section, but for the moment, let's just return to the main timeline of mayhem here. In August 1956, a frogman in service with the SDECE traveled to the city of Trieste, northern Italy, to prowl the port in search of one of the ships operated by weapons traffickers. Clearly, the supplier of the armed wing of the FLN, the National Liberation Army, or the ALN. The operative's goal was to place an explosive charge under the vessel's keel and set the fuse to go off when the ship reached a speed of 10 knots. The mission, however, was aborted as the target did not show up. In the same month, another frogman boarded a boat in Tangier, Morocco, and then approached yet another merchant vessel. Once again, the hit was cancelled due to security concerns, as the operative's boat was spotted by the arms traffickers. The following month, Service 8 shifted its attention directly to the Hamburg offices of a major arms dealer, Otto Schluter. The deflagration heavily damaged the premises and wounded Schluter, while killing his associate Wilhelm Lorenzen. In November, the Red Hand agents targeted another dealer, Ahmed Kamal, while he was staying at a hotel in Madrid. But when the assassin reached the address, quote, the target had left the hotel for an unknown destination. In December 1956, the SDECE operatives organized what may have been their most ambitious operation, a bomb attack against the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. At the time, France, as well as the UK, had a major beef with President Nasser following his nationalization and seizure of the Suez Canal. A joint Anglo-French military expedition to retake the canal faced opposition from the UN, the Soviet Union, and even the US, thus ending in a humiliating withdrawal. Right after the end of the international crisis, a French commando, supported by the Israeli Mossad, placed 300 kilograms of TNT in the main square of Port Said. The charge was then rigged with a detonator that could be activated remotely, and everything was ready to blow up the president and dozens of bystanders, presumably. Once again, higher-ups in the French government decided to cancel the assassination at the last minute. The SDECE was still out against Nasser in February 1957 when their indefatigable frogmen placed explosives under the hull of an Egyptian oil tanker moored in Istanbul. This action could have resulted in a huge loss of life as well as an environmental disaster, but it appears that the charge malfunctioned or detached from the hull, leaving the ship unharmed. The following month, the relentless operatives fought to destroy FLN bases in Tunis. One of them, however, was arrested by the Tunisian police before he could carry out the attack. Following interrogation, the agent was released and was later able to place a timed explosive charge. The premises were destroyed and 3 FLN members died in the explosion. The following month, April 1957, a parcel was delivered at the house of Rahal Saad in Meknes, Morocco. Mr. Saad was a pharmacist and a member of an organization of healthcare professionals who offered their services to the FLN. So, you probably guessed who the sender was. The Red Hand bomb within the parcel exploded, killing Mr. Saad and his entire family. The memo compiled by the SDECE commented this action as destruction of the objective and his family R1. In the rating system applied by the Secret Service in their sinister hit list, R1 stood for complete success. A French newswire published on the 22nd of April 1957 noted that Mr. Saad had stopped paying his contribution to FLN agents, which implied that the pharmacist had been assassinated by the liberation movement themselves. According to Damien van Pueveld, writing for Journal Intelligence and National Security, quote, this dispatch is probably a piece of disinformation authored by French propagandists to maintain plausible deniability and turn the local population against the FLN. This would suggest that French authorities coordinated some of their paramilitary and information operations to enforce their deniability and maximize their psychological impact. The spring and summer of 1957 saw the Red Hand operatives of the SDECE on a roll, scoring a series of successful operations. In April, a group of FLN representatives traveled to Lyon, France, to conduct a secret arms deal with local traffickers. As they handed out their cash to the suppliers, the traffickers revealed themselves to be SDEC agents. The operation was marked an R1 success as it concluded with the, quote, arrest of interested party, recovery of the arms and money resulting from the sale. At least no explosive violence was used on that occasion, so we suppose that's something. Now, the same can't be said for the extremely effective raid conducted by one Captain Liga, a veteran of previous counterinsurgency operations in Algeria. Around May of 1957, Liga chartered a catamaran under an assumed name in southern France and then sailed to Tangier in Morocco. As night fell, the experienced frogmen infiltrated the harbour and placed explosive charges, each weighing 20 kilos, under the hulls of several cargo ships belonging to German arms smuggler Georges Puchet. Their detonator was set to go off only when the ships would leave port and then reach a speed of 10 knots. Thus, in the ensuing months, Puchet lost 5 vessels to Leguer's bombs: the Brujaraya, the Bara, the Sirocco, the Typhoon, and the Emma. Quite the windfall for the SDECE. Now, Georges Puchet was a close associate of arms dealer Otto Schluter. If you remember, his officers had already been bombed back in September 1956. Well, the service aid agents weren't done with him yet. In June 1957, a charge was placed under his car. As the ignition key was turned on, the vehicle blew up, but Herr Schluter was not harmed because that day his mother was at the wheel. She didn't survive. The final blow against the Schluter operations was dealt on the 1st of October 1958 when his cargo, Atlas, was sunk by an explosion in the port of Hamburg. Miraculously, none of the 32 sailors on board were harmed. A subsequent inquiry found that 2 small bombs had been attached to the bilge keels and noted that the Atlas had recently returned from the Algerian port of Skikda. But let's go back to June 1957, when another hit was directed against a healthcare professional, this time a French national. Dr. Louis Ternelot was the head of medicine at a hospital in Oujda in Morocco, known to authorities for treating Algerian independence fighters. One hot summer evening, the doctor was still at work, while his family was waiting for him at home just across the road. That's when 2 kilos of plastic explosives blew up the terrorist of the Ternelot's residence, injuring the doctor's wife and their 6-year-old daughter. Until his death in 1996, Louis Ternelot was led to believe that the device had been planted by a Moroccan national. Later that summer, another hit was conducted in Morocco, this time in Rabat. The target, one Bouzidia, who does not appear in any other record than the declassified list. He was shot in a street at night with a suppressed firearm and left severely injured. In September 1957, the attention turned again to arms dealers. A cargo known as the Victoria S, owner unknown, was rigged with explosives while moored at Tripoli, Libya, before sinking just off Sfax, Tunisia. A second attack, also planned to take place in Tunisia, went awry, however. The device carried by the operators exploded prematurely, killing them all in the process. Then the Red Hand assassins took a trip to Geneva. Their first action was the fatal stabbing of Georges Geister, a manufacturer of detonators. Then, on September the 19th, a dart laced with curare pierced into the skin of arms dealer Mr. Leopold, as described at the beginning of today's episode. Next, the grim list from the declassified archives features a rather puzzling entry, stating simply that in October 1957, a frogman placed a charge under a Finnish cargo ship, which then sank in the Atlantic. Another operation ranked as R1. According to shipping registries, only one Finnish vessel experienced a shipwreck in 1957. This was the freighter Corso, which went down off the coast of Portugal on the 6th of November 1957 while on a trip from Bayonne, southern France, to Dakar, Senegal. It lost 3 of its crew members, while the remaining 8 escaped on a lifeboat and were rescued by a Turkish ship. This freighter had a rather interesting history, as it had been first commissioned in 1943 as a Royal Canadian Navy ship, the HSMC Ironbound. Shipping company Gustav Eriksson purchased it in May of 1954, repurposing it as a merchantman under its new name, Corso. After the shipwreck, a naval inquiry determined that the cargo had been lost to an explosion, likely caused by a forgotten mine from World War II. That in itself would be newsworthy. A former Royal Canadian ship falls victim to the Battle of the Atlantic 12 years after the end of the war. But the evidence, however circumstantial, indicated that Corso may have been a casualty of another conflict, the secret war waged by the Frogmen of Service 8. The year 1957 was concluded by another success for the Red Hand when a timed explosive device completely destroyed an explosive depot belonging to the National Liberation Army, or ALN, in Nador, Morocco. According to French military intelligence reports, this depot was a clandestine arms factory set up by German arms dealers and employing former members of the French Foreign Legion. Which takes us to the German connection that we hinted at earlier. The long-suffering Schluter and Pluchart were not isolated cases of German nationals supplying the FLN and ALN with weapons. They belonged to a network of sympathizers operating through Germany, France, Italy, and the Maghreb, often in conjunction with left-wing groups. This network may have even been sponsored by the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, the ruling majority party in West Germany at the time. And the CDU may have involved itself in the conflict, albeit indirectly, as a means to expand West German influence over North Africa and the Middle East to oust French presence and thus secure profitable energy deals with local governments. Among their activities, the network also oversaw the escape of French foreign legionnaires and deserters, most of whom were German citizens. Now, many of these deserters would go on to support the ALN in the weapons factories or even serve as fighters among their ranks. According to the Historical Division of the French Foreign Legion, one of the main organizers of such desertions was a German engineer living in Tétouan in Morocco, Wilhelm Schutz-Liessem. Apparently, Schutz-Liessem was one of the lead figures, if not the lead figure, of a left-wing exfiltration network which facilitated the desertion of 4,111 German and Austrian legionnaires. Naturally, he would fall well within the crosshairs of the Red Hands. An unsigned, declassified French intelligence memo dated August 1, 1958, in fact stated that the Chief of Defense Staff has proposed to SDECE that this individual, Schutz-Liessem, whose action is harmful to French interests in Algeria, be neutralized. Following a reconnaissance mission, a commercial contact had been established with Schutz-Liessem. This contact, maintained by correspondence, should allow us to attract the objective in a favorable location in Morocco and to treat him discreetly by using an undetectable toxin with delayed effects. The memo featured a handwritten note stating that the action had been agreed upon by Admiral Georges Cabarnier, Chief of Defense Staff, and then countersigned by Jacques Foccart, advisor to President Charles de Gaulle for American Affairs. In other words, this memo proved that two high-ranking members of the presidential cabinet had directly sanctioned the assassination of a German civilian. Schutz-Liessem would not be poisoned, however. Apparently, the engineer worked as an asset for the BND, the West German Secret Services, who managed to exfiltrate him to safety in Spain. Germany would still be at the center of Service 8 actions from 1958 to 1960. On November 5, 1958, a high-ranking member of the FLN, Amizian Ait Achenye, was hit by a spray of light machine gun fire in a Bonn street. He would die months later of his injuries. Then again, on January 19, 1959, Abid El Sulam was shot dead outside the Saarbrücken train station. And on March 3, 1959, a car exploded into a fireball. Inside, the charred remains of its owner, arms dealer Georges Pucher, whose cargo ships had already been destroyed in 1957, sat. On January 2, 1960, Abdul Qadir Nawasri, an arms bar with the FLN, received a parcel at his Frankfurt home. Inside, he found an unexpected present, a book titled The Pacification. He would never read it, however, as the book had been emptied and then filled with plastic explosives. As the device exploded, Nasri survived the blast, but lost both of his hands. The Red Hand operatives of Service 8 would exact further mutilation on October 16, 1960, when a bomb attack severely injured Munich resident Wilhelm Beisner. The former Waffen-SS officer had served in North Africa during World War II, and even in the post-war period had maintained close ties with the region, especially with Arab nationalist leaders. Beisner had been active in the arms trade in the late 1940s, but it is not clear whether he was still supplying Algerian independentists at the time of the attack. What we do know, however, is that Beisner had been recruited by the German security services, the BND, in October of 1957. This was the second confirmed instance of Service 8 directly targeting one of their German counterparts. But it appears that the subsequent inquiry did not determine any likely culprit, and the case was deemed unsolved for decades. Mr. Beisner lost one of his legs, but luckily he survived. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for dozens, if not hundreds more individuals who fell foul of the Red Hand conspiracy. We provided details only about a handful of Service 8 clandestine operations, and believe us, there is a lot more, to say nothing of several further actions which were not listed in the declassified report. Eventually, it was all a futile waste of human life. Recognizing that the war was a drain on France's economy, morale, and prestige, in September 1959, President de Gaulle extended a hand to the FLN, promising a referendum on self-determination. This decision angered the Algerian French, the Pieds Noirs, prompting the creation of the Organization of the Secret Army, or OAS, a terrorist group which even tried to overthrow the French government, and which definitely deserves an episode of its own. Let us know if you want that in the comments below. As tensions mounted at home and abroad, the president acknowledged that any military gain in Algeria would be undermined by political and diplomatic defeat on the international stage. In March 1962, France and the FLN agreed to a ceasefire, followed by Algerian independence in July. Before their eventual defeat, French military and security leaders may have considered their Red Hand covert actions as legitimate in the context of what was an incredibly bitter and hard-fought war. After all, every conflict sooner or later involves the death and destruction of civilian targets involved in the war effort. And unfortunately, war always exacts casualties amongst innocent bystanders. And yet the same leadership went to great lengths to misdirect, to conceal, and to bury the conspiracy deep beneath the layers of forgotten history. But history is at times a bit of a shallow grave. And the soil covering the killing spree of the so-called Red Hand was gradually brushed away by the efforts of writers Roger Falagot and Pascal Kropp in the 1980s, and more recently by author Vincent Nazil and Le Monde journalist Jacques Fullereau. And we hope we have contributed our small share here too by revealing this affair to the non-French-speaking world, lest it slip back once again into the shadows of history.